What's up, everybody? Welcome back. This is part 3 of the video series on the leasing paradox. So if you didn't watch part 1 and 2, make sure you do so before watching this, because I'm going to be continuing the same question that we went over in the previous parts. So let's do a quick summary, quick review of what we did in the first 2 parts. In the first part, we introduced the leasing paradox. Basically, we found out that when the leasee has a positive MPV, the leaser has a negative MPV, and vice versa. So it's basically a win-lose situation, which sort of sucks, meaning it's a paradox. How can a leasing transaction ever come to fruition if one party is winning and the other party is losing? Then what we went over in the second video was a potential solution to that. Not the best solution, but a potential one where the MPV, if both the MPV to both parties is equal to 0, it means both parties are going to be indifferent. Neither are going to be winning or losing. They're just sort of going to be neutral about it. And we found out that the lease payment for this specific scenario that will make both parties indifferent was this figure here, 562,232.43. And then using that indifferent lease payment, we were able to add conditions to both of these 2 scenarios here for this specific question. Now, what we're going to go over in this video is a solution 2, where both the leasee and the leaser can win, where both of them will have a positive MPV. Now, how are we going to do that? Well, this can only happen when the tax rate of the leasee does not equal the tax rate of the leaser. If both have different tax rates, then there is a potential solution to this paradox where both the leasee and the leaser can get positive MPVs from a leasing transaction. Because if you notice so far, this question that we've been dealing with, these 3 different scenarios, the tax rate for both parties was the same, and it was 35%. So the tax rate of the leasee and the tax rate of the leaser was the same. And when the tax rates are the same, only one of these 3 scenarios can happen. However, if the leasee and the leaser have different tax rates, then you can potentially get a positive MPV for both. Not all the time, but there is a potential. Now, fortunately, this is a pretty realistic scenario that could come up, where the tax rate of the leasee is different than the tax rate of the leaser. And the reason is because usually both of these parties are in different stages of business. Usually the leaser is a bigger company, the one that is leasing out assets to a leasee. So because usually the leaser is a bigger company, usually they're making more income, that means that their tax rate is usually greater than the leasee's tax rate. Not always, but usually. And most likely, in this chapter, you're going to be running into situations where the tax rate of the leasee is going to be less than the tax rate of the leaser. And then if both tax rates are different, there's a potential for both parties to have a positive MPV in a leasing transaction. So let's add a question to this scenario where we're going to switch up the tax rates. So part D, remember part A, B, and C we went over in the previous videos. So the question for part D is, assume your company doesn't expect to pay taxes over the next few years. Should you lease or buy the machine? Okay, should you lease or buy the machine? Basically, you have to solve the MPV to your company. Now, your company is the leasee, so we're going to have to solve for the MPV to the leasee, and the MPV to the leasee is the same as the net advantage to leasing. So we're going to have to solve for the net advantage to leasing again. That's going to give us the present value of all the cash flows of this agreement from our company's point of view. However, now we're going to have to solve for this with a different tax rate. Now, if we don't expect to pay any taxes, that means that we are in a very low tax bracket. Basically, our tax rate is 0. So we have to redo this calculation that we did in Part A, but we have to do it with a tax rate of 0. Everything else is going to be the same. Lease payments are going to be the same. You're still borrowing at 9%. Machine costs $2.9 million. You're going to be leasing the machine for 7 years. Everything else stays the same except for this here. The tax rate now for your company is going to be 0, and we're going to be calculating the net advantage to leasing with that tax rate of 0. So let's fill in all of the components for the net advantage to leasing when the tax rate is 0. So what's the investment going to be? Well, the investment is still the cost of the machine. The machine still costs $2,900,000. So that's going to be the same. Now, what's the present value of the after-tax lease payments going to be? Well, notice because that tax rate is 0, this after-tax portion is sort of irrelevant because we're not paying any taxes. So we're still going to have to solve for an annuity, right? So we're still going to be solving for PV. Our FV is going to be 0. This lease is still happening for 7 years. But what is the payment going to be? Usually, the PMT that we input here, as we did in Part A, is the after-tax lease payment. But because there are no taxes, basically, before tax figure times 1 minus 0, right? Tax rate of 0 is just going to be the before tax figure times 1, which is still the before tax figure, right? So the PMT that we're going to input in this specific question in Part D is the $550,000. We don't have to take it on an after-tax basis because the tax rate is 0. So basically, the after-tax lease payment is the same as the before-tax lease payment when the tax rate is 0. Hence, the PMT that we input is the $550,000. Now, what about the I that we have to input? I sort of put the I over here because I was running out of room at the bottom. Usually, the I here that we input is the after-tax cost of debt. If you remember, in Part A, we inputted 5.85, which was 9% times 1 minus t. However, again, the tax rate in Part D is 0. So 9 times 1 minus 0 would just still give us 9. So the I that we input in this specific question is that before tax cost of debt, because when the tax rate is 0, the after-tax cost of debt is the same as the before tax cost of debt. So we input these variables, so the FV is still 0, N is still 7, the PMT changed to 550,000, and now the I changed to 9. It's now just the cost of debt that we were given. So when we solve for that PV, we end up getting $2,768,124.06. So that figure is what we're going to input here. So 2768124.06. So we are done with that portion of the net advantage to leasing. Let's continue on. What's the present value of the CCA going to be? Well, if our tax rate is 0, if we're not paying any taxes, then notice how we can't really take advantage of the CCA of the machine. Because what CCA does is it allows us to depreciate assets to lower our taxes. But if we're not paying any taxes, then there's no value to us depreciating the machine. So the present value of the CCA is going to be 0. And that always happens when this tax rate is equal to 0 when you're not paying taxes. And you could see that with the formula as well. If you look at the formula, if you plug in 0 for all of the t's, you would end up getting 0 just overall. So present value of the CCA is going to be 0. We're not getting any value from the CCA. The machine is still valueless, so that present value of salvage is 0 as well. So really, if we're not paying any taxes, the net advantage to leasing calculation becomes a lot easier. We just have the investment, and we have to take the present value of the lease payments, and we don't have to take the lease payment on an after-tax basis, and we don't have to take the cost of debt on an after-tax basis either. We just have to present value them as an annuity, and we get that figure there. So when we net those out, we end up getting $131,875.94. So that's going to be the net advantage to leasing, or the NPV to the leasee, to us, our company, if our company is not paying any taxes. If our tax rate is equal to 0, this is a positive net advantage to leasing, positive NPV to the leasee, meaning that we should lease the machine. So same conclusion that we reached in part A. That's not always going to happen. You may get a negative NPV when you switch up the tax rates. However, in this case, we came to the same conclusion. We're going to lease the machine. The net advantage to leasing figure was different, but both of them were positive in part A and in this part, in part D. So, answer, should you buy or lease the machine? You should lease it because your net advantage to leasing is positive. And now finally, for the last question, the most important question, if your company doesn't pay taxes and company A is still paying 35% tax, what range of lease payments will be profitable for both parties? So now, this question is going to give us that second solution to our paradox, where hopefully we can find a lease payment or a range of lease payments where the NPV for both your company, the leasee, and company A, the leaseor, is going to be positive. Now, if you remember, at the end of the second video, I also had the chart up at the beginning of this video. We added a specific condition for this scenario that the NPV to the leaseor is going to be positive. It's going to be greater than 0 when the lease payment is going to be greater than $562,232.43. This lease payment here we got as the payment that would make both the leaseor and the leasee indifferent if both of them are in a 35% tax bracket. And since the leaseor in this question in part E is still in that 35% tax bracket, this figure stays the same. So the leaseor is profitable. They have a positive NPV when the lease payment is greater than this amount. Now, what about the leasee? When is the NPV for the leasee going to be greater than 0? Well, that's going to happen when the lease payment is going to be less than the lease payment that makes them indifferent, that makes their NPV equal to 0. Because if we find a lease payment that makes the leasee indifferent, well, any lease payment less than that is going to be a win for them because they're going to be paying less money. The problem is that now we switched up the tax rate for the leasee. The tax rate for the leasee is 0. They're not paying any taxes. And when we had this condition in the second video, the lease payment was less than this figure. But that's when the leasee was in a 35% tax bracket. In this question, they are not paying any taxes. So what we have to do is we have to now find when is the NPV to the leasee going to equal 0? What lease payment will make the NPV for the leasee equal to 0 with this new tax bracket where their tax rate is 0? Right? Because in part D, we didn't really solve for that. For part D, we solved the net advantage to leasing, the NPV to the leasee, for a specific scenario. This scenario of these lease payments of $550,000. Now what we have to do is we have to figure out, like we did in part C, what lease payment will make the net present value to the leasee equal to 0 when their tax rate now is 0%. So when the NPV of the leasee is equal to 0, that's the same when the net advantage to leasing is equal to 0. And the net advantage to leasing, we know it's what? It's the investment, right? The machine costs $2.9 million still. As we did in Part C, that present value of the after-tax lease payments, or we could just call it present value of lease payments in this case, because the leasee, us, our company, is not paying any taxes. Remember, this is for when the tax is 0. Like we did in Part C, since we're solving for that portion, we'll put a variable x there. And again, since we're paying no taxes, the PV of CCA is 0, and the PV of salvage is 0 as well, because the machine is still valueless. So really all we have to do is solve this equation here. So if we bring the x over, this x is going to equal 2,900,000, because these are the only components of the net advantage to leasing when someone is paying, or the leasee is paying, no taxes, when the tax rate is equal to 0. Now again, what does this give us though? This gives us the present value of the lease payments. Right? Usually it gives us the present value of the after-tax lease payments, but again, since there's no taxes, it's just the present value of the lease payments. The before-tax lease payments, after-tax lease payments are the same. So this is not what we're looking for. This is the present value of the annuity, of the lease payment annuity. So what we have to do with this now is we have to plug this value in the financial calculator. So the present value is going to be 2.9 million. Future value is going to be 0. What's the I going to be? Well, the I, we're not paying any taxes, remember. So the after-tax cost of debt, which usually goes here, in this case is the same as the before-tax cost of debt, which is just 9%. N is 7, right? There are 7 lease payments being made. And these lease payments are still being made at the end of each year, right? It's not specified that they're happening at the beginning. So what we're going to do is now we're going to solve for that lease payment that would make the leasee indifferent, that will make their NPV equal to 0. So when we solve for that PMT, we end up getting 576,202.50. So this here represents the after-tax lease payment. However, because we're not paying any taxes, the tax rate is 0, that's the same as the before-tax lease payment. Right? So usually what happens when we're solving for that lease payment that makes a party indifferent, if they are paying a tax rate, this ends up being the after-tax lease payment, and we have to convert it to a before-tax basis. But since there's no taxes, this is just the before-tax lease payment right there. So going back to what we originally wrote at the beginning of the question, NPV to the leaseor is greater than 0 when the lease payment is greater than $562,232.43. We figured that out at the end of Part C, right? The leaseor is in a 35% tax bracket. And now we just figured out the NPV to the leasee is going to be positive when the lease payment is less than $576,202.50, because this payment was the payment that made the leasee indifferent. So any payments less than that, the leasee is going to have a positive NPV. And notice if we combine both of these conditions, well, we can combine them. That is a feasible solution. So basically, if the lease payment is greater than this amount, 562,232.43, and it's less than this amount, 576,202.50. If the lease payment is in between these, then both parties are going to have a positive NPV. And that is a solution to the paradox. And notice that that happened where the tax rates were different, right? The tax rate of the leasee was 0, and the tax rate of the lessor stayed at 35%. Now, the tax rate of the leasee isn't always going to be 0. Usually, it's going to be less than the tax rate of the lessor, as we mentioned. It could be another rate, though. It could be maybe 10% or 15%. But a lot of times, they'll say the leasee pays no taxes. So it will just be the same steps that we just followed. And we got a feasible solution, which was this. If the lease payment is in between these two figures, then both the leasee and the lessor will have a positive NPV. Both will have a win-win scenario. Now, one last thing I want to make a note of is that you won't always get a feasible solution. Okay, so what if pretend that instead of this 576,202.5 figure, we got a figure of 560,000? Well, notice how that's not going to work, because in order for the leasee to have a positive NPV, the lease payment has to be less than 560,000. And in order for the lessor to have a positive NPV, the lease payment has to be greater than 562,232.43. And a lease payment being less than 560,000 and greater than this number, that's impossible. That's not a feasible solution. And that can happen. So you got to make sure that you look at the numbers, and you got to make sure that they both make sense for there to be a feasible solution. In this case, both numbers did make sense. However, it's also possible for you to get numbers where there won't be any feasible solution. So just be aware of that. So to conclude, to summarize what we went over in these 3 videos. So in the first video, what we showed was that if the tax rate of the leasee equals the tax rate of the lessor, so both of them were paying 35% tax. If the leasee had a positive NPV, the lessor had a negative NPV. And if the leasee had a negative NPV, the lessor had a positive NPV. And that happened with these 2 conditions. Now, these conditions we figured out in the second video. However, these 2 conditions relate to these 2 scenarios that we showed in the first video. And we concluded in the first video that this here was the leasing paradox, basically a win-lose situation. So then we wanted to find solutions to it. So in the second video, we went over our first solution. Our first solution, not the best one, was when both parties were indifferent. So when the NPV to both parties was equal to 0. And we found that to be true when the lease payment was equal to this amount. And then we were able to use that amount to input the conditions for the previous 2 scenarios. Now, these 3 scenarios always happened because the tax rate of the leasee was equal to the tax rate of the lessor. Both had a tax rate of 35%. So then, in the third video, in this video that we just completed, we went over a second solution for where both parties can have a positive NPV. That can only happen when their tax rates are different. The leasee's tax rate and the lessor's tax rates are different. And in this case, the leasee's tax rate was 0% and the lessor's tax rate was 35%. And we got a feasible solution right here. So if the lease payment is in between these 2 numbers, then both parties would have a positive NPV. And that is it for leasing paradox. That concludes everything. Hopefully you got all of that. A lot of information to take in. You'll probably have to rewatch this series before your midterm and before your exam. Anyway, if you're not subscribed to the channel, please do so. You can subscribe right here. If you know anyone that would benefit from this material, just point them to my website, www.fin401.ca. Basically the course code.ca. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace out.